All right, we're live. Yeah, it's totally working. Yep, thank you. All right, hey everybody. My name is Kent. I don't have any slides for this talk. I'm actually just we're just going to watch Dan's talk, and that's my talk. No, just kidding. But how many of you have seen this talk before? Okay, cool. That's actually really good. Because I am not going to give you the high-level why behind React Suspense as much. Dan's talk does a really great job of that, so I strongly recommend you take a look at this. Here, actually, right here at the beginning.
Little
Yeah.
tweet.
Here's a tweet. Listen to this.
Using a strange new API, I have never felt this productive using React before. You're going to hate it. Then you're going to love it. We'll spill some beans in a week at JS Conf IS.
So I like this API, this new React Suspense thing is changing. Like, it's going to change your life as a React developer. It is so great, but at first it might seem really like weird and confusing. But it just like a ton of code goes away with React Suspense. I'm so excited about this. So anyway, Dan talks in this talk. He talks about time slicing, which is async React, which you don't have to actually do a whole lot other than make your code not do weird things. You just use React and it'll work nicely. And there's this new deferred set state API thing. But then he talks about, and he gives this really awesome demo. Here, let's find where he shows the slide. Data fetching and code splitting. So how React is solving I/O. So I strongly recommend you check this out. His demo is way cooler than the demo I'm going to show you because his shows you an actual like useful use case for what this suspense thing will do and like what it's capable of. But in so doing, to make it a useful example, there's a whole bunch of extra stuff in, like a bunch of extra code in there that kind of hides away the abstraction or the simplicity of the abstraction, makes it seem more complicated than it is. And so the object of my talk is to show you at like its bare fundamental level what suspense is, how it works, and how you can use it in your app. With that said, this is a meetup, so feel free to raise your hand and interrupt me if you have questions. I might say, let's talk about that later, and I'm not trying to offend you. So yeah, feel free to ask questions as we go. All right, cool. So what is suspense? Actually, we'll just look at this. So in Dan's little demo, come on, here, let me turn this down. Okay, in Dan's demo, come on, go to the main. Oh, actually, this is the main app. Sorry, I was confusing it with another app. He has a list of these movies, and then you click on one of these movies, and it's a master or a list detail kind of thing. So you've got a list of items, you click on one, and it'll take you to the details of those items. And in the web, the way that works, like back in the day, before we had client-side apps, is you would click on a link, it would go to the server, and it would say, hey, get me some HTML for this thing. And when that server responds, that's when the browser says, okay, now I'm going to go over to that page. And so the user is just sitting here waiting on this page that they click that link on until that server is sending the response. Now with single-page apps, the way that we do it is you click on a link and you instantly go to that page, and then you see a bunch of loading spinners as the data comes in. And the loading spinners aren't necessarily a problem, and that experience isn't necessarily a problem, but it's kind of an artifact of the way that we build applications today. It just is easier to make things work that way, to have it just go to the page. We render those components say, hey, I need to go get data, that show these spinners. And the amount of code that it takes and the complexity that it adds to our application for that to work is non-trivial, especially if you're using something like Redux, which you're like, okay, dispatch a loading action, dispatch a loaded action, dispatch an error action, dispatching all these weird actions. It just adds a non-trivial amount of code to our applications. And so React Suspense is a way of handling asynchronous data fetching or any asynchronous type of interaction for a component. So you have your component, I need this data. It's just a really nice way of getting a component's data in a co-located fashion. So that's pretty much all I'm going to give you on the why of this. The rest of my talk is going to be about the how. So yeah, that's what we're talking about. So I got this simple HTML document, index.html. We're loading React DOM, this simple cache provider thing, which we'll use in a little bit, and then Babel standalone. And I'm using Babel standalone because in my effort to make this as simple and straightforward as possible, we're not using any build tools. There's no Webpack, no rollup, no create React app, nothing. This is all regular web technologies. But at the same time, I don't want to try to write React without JSX, and so we're using Babel standalone, which actually will compile JSX in the browser. So you'll see a little warning in the console about that, because yeah, you generally wouldn't want to do this in a real app. But doing the things this way will hopefully make it more straightforward for you to see where the lines are drawn around Suspense versus the tools that you use to build this stuff. So yeah, then we've got our body. Did you know that you can make an ID an emoji? So that's what we're doing here. This is where we're going to mount our app. And then I've got some script tags here. We are in the playground, and we're just rendering app to that node. Okay, cool. So let's take a theoretical situation. Very contrived. I'm just going to copy a little bit of code here. So I've got this sleep function, and I can specify the amount of time and what the resolved value should be. So this sleep function could be here, actually, you know what? I'm going to just grab this thing. We'll call this load resource. So now I have this function that returns a promise, because sleep returns this promise. So it's this asynchronous function that takes an ID and goes to load some data, right? In our case, it's totally contrived. It's not actually hitting a server. But you can imagine that this would, after 1 second, go and get some data, and it's just going to be a string that is the ID dash value, okay? So pretend that this is going to make an asynchronous request to get, I don't know, information about Pikachu. We need to asynchronously load this resource when our component is rendered. So I'm going to make a component called foo, and we're going to return a div with that value. So whatever the value that we get from loading this resource. So what we have to do typically in React is we'd say we'll make a React component called foo. Here, let me just get rid of this for a sec. And it has to be a class component because that's just the way life is. And then we'll say this dot state dot data, and then component did mount. We'll say load resource foo, and then we'll say data. This dot set state data. Sweet. I think that's it. And then we'll say foo, and something's busted. Oh, thank you. I thought that was too easy. Ta-da! Yay! We loaded data. Okay, so we're not handling error cases here. We're not handling showing a loading state. So we could add a loading state, but I'm not going to waste our time. You all have made requests, or many of you have made requests like these to get some data. Many of you are probably using some other abstraction to get some data and stuff. It's a non-trivial amount of code to do stuff like this, and generally you have to spread your data requirements across multiple files, modules, and components, and it just would be really nice if we could co-locate all of our data needs into one place. So that's kind of what React Suspense is going to allow us to do. So with Suspense, we can throw a promise. Well, okay, so the way that it works, or what we can do here is I'm going to say result equals load resource foo. Now, result is a promise, but I'm going to just render the result. Okay, actually, this just suddenly reminded me of something in Angular. How many people did AngularJS? Wait, literally like 2 people? What? Wow. Huh, that's interesting. Utah loves Angular though. That's weird. Okay, so any of you use $resource? Any of the 2 of you? Yeah, okay, there's my man. All right. So $resource was kind of an older thing. I think they kind of got rid of it after a while. I think it was like an Angular 1.2 or something, and then they're like, yeah, this was a bad idea. Well, $resource actually allowed you to render promises, which was kind of interesting. And then when it resolved, it would render to the actual value. It's kind of wild. This is what it kind of looks like. But this isn't. This wouldn't actually work. If I try to do this, it's going to give me an error saying, hey, objects are not valid as a React child. The object that we're trying to render is this promise. We're trying to render a promise. That doesn't really work. So we need to have some way to tell React, hey, I don't want you to actually render this until that promise is resolved. So how do we do that? Let me just cheat really quick because I kind of forgot. Okay. I'm gonna actually teach this in the reverse way from what I was going to do in the first place. So we're going to use what's called the simple cache provider. So I've got it loaded onto the page right here. This is an NPM module. You can get it, it's published right now. It has this big warning that says, don't use this. And I probably should have prefaced the talk with like, does not exist yet. You're seeing smoke and mirrors. I'm using a version of React that is, it's technically published to NPM, but not available, or you shouldn't be using it, because the API will change. But it will be more solid toward the end of the year. So anyway, simple cache provider, loaded onto the page. It's on simple cache provider. It gives us a couple of things here, so we can create a cache and create a resource. So, and you'll learn a little bit more about how those work here in a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make my resource, and that's going to be create resource, load resource. So what create resource does is it creates an object that we can use to read data asynchronously in a way that React can be notified when things are supposed to be loaded asynchronously. So we'll say myResource.read, and then we'll pass our ID. But it needs to read that information into a cache so that when that resource is actually loaded, that resource result will get put into a cache. So the first argument here we're going to say is cache. Okay, so I refresh here, it's going to break again, and that is because no placeholder UI was provided. That's probably really small. Let me just, and actually we don't need this. Let's just do full console. Okay, so it says an update was suspended, so we're using React Suspense here, but no updater or no placeholder UI was provided. So with React, when we call myResource.read, what it's actually doing under the hood, and we'll implement this here in a little bit, but it's throwing a promise. You know, you can like throw new error blah, or perhaps you've even just thrown blah. Don't ever do that. Please don't. Throw a real error object so you can get a stack trace. But what React is doing, what this read function is doing, it's throwing a promise, which is pretty wild. And React understands when a promise is thrown, it's going to say, oh, okay, I'm going to suspend that, not going to render this, because the rest of this code won't run, you know, once anything's thrown, it's not going to run the rest of this code. And so it says, oh, okay, I'll catch that thrown promise, and I'm going to wait until that promise resolves. When it does, I'm going to re-render this component. But what should it render while it's waiting? That is what a placeholder is for. So we're going to say react.placeholder, and then we'll render foo inside of that. And we need to have a fallback value for when that thing hasn't loaded yet. So we'll say fallback loading, and that could be a React component. Anything that's renderable, you can pass to fallback. So it's loading, and then foo value is rendered. Okay. So we are going to implement this read function to understand a little bit more what's going on there. We'll also implement the cache. But fundamentally, this is what's going on here is when I say read, I'm going to throw a promise. React will say, okay, that's great. Let me render the fallback until that promise is resolved. When it is resolved, then I will render all of my children. Okay. One thing that's super annoying, have you ever seen like a flash of a loading spinner? You go to a page and like for a millisecond, well, okay, not a millisecond, our eyes aren't that fast. For like, I don't know, 200 milliseconds, you see a spinner and you're like, that was kind of janky. Well, so React has a built-in capability for delay at milliseconds, and we'll say, I don't know, how about 1,000? Here, we'll say 1,500. So, actually, hold on a second. Isn't it delay? Ah, snap, what is it? I can't remember what the placeholder is. Here, let me find it really quick. I'm going to dive into React source code. I forgot to look this up. Placeholder. We're having fun. Okay, there are only 7 of these. Ah, snap. Delay. Oh, dang it. There is a delay something. And I'm sorry, I forgot to look that up. But there's a delay. You can say, okay, don't show the loading spinner or don't show the fallback until after a certain amount of time. I'm not sure where that is. There's also, actually, there is a timeout. Maybe that's where the delay is, but it is a little bit different. It's a render prop API and stuff. Okay, sweet. So does anybody have questions so far? Okay, we are going to dive a little bit deeper into some of this stuff. But, so let's go ahead and we'll render a couple of things. So we've got foo here. Let's change this to foo bar, and we'll render both foo and a bar. Oh snap! So we're gonna say this is foo result and bar result resource read cache bar. All right, so we're gonna go get the bar thing. We'll put this in a div. Put them both in a div here. And bar results. Okay, cool. So now we're loading, and yeah, and then we get both of these. So here is a little bit of a trick that is happening right here. Is we load this foo result, like when React first renders this, it comes here and it says, hey, I'm throwing a promise. Okay, I'm going to wait, and I'm not going to run the rest of this code because I literally threw a promise. That's just how JavaScript works. That's not a React thing. So like I threw something, so I can't run that. So I'm going to go read the foo, and then it says, oh, foo is done. Now I'm going to continue to, or I'm going to try to re-render this thing, and then we throw another promise. And it's like, oh, okay, I'll just sit here and twiddle my thumbs again, waiting for this. But there's nothing between, like, there are many situations where we want our requests to go simultaneously. In Dan's example, you have the details and then you have reviews, and they are not interdependent, so you can simultaneously make those requests and wait for them to come back. And if you run it serially like this, then you're going to have a little bit of trouble, or it just won't run as fast. So we want to be able to preload these, have them loaded before we actually make any requests. So React has something for this built in as well. I'm going to come down here to app, and because app knows that, hey, foobar is going to render these things, then instead of read, we're going to say preload, and that just fires off this effect that says, hey, my resource, however you load things, which for us is this load resource function that sleeps. However you load things, just go start that loading. And because it's using a cache, when we go to do this read thing, it's actually going to return the same promise so that it doesn't make like 2 requests. So when we do that, loading happens a lot faster. So here, let me increase the sleep time. We'll increase it to 2 seconds. And you'll see 1, 2, foobar. And then if I get rid of that preload, you see 1, 2, 3, 4. I count too fast. There he goes. So, so React has the ability to prefetch the things that you know that you're going to need. Implementing all this stuff in, like, today React is not like super fun. Implementing this in any framework is not super fun. And now React makes it like really quite straightforward, which is pretty cool. And we don't have to put it here. If we wanted to, we could put it right here. And that would work just as well. Just depends on where you know where the data is and when you want to start. We're actually just going to get rid of this altogether, and we'll just assign our cache and our resource to the values that they should be just in regular JavaScript, just so you can see how this is all working under the hood. Sound cool? Any questions before we do that? Yes? Yeah. So the question is, like, could we use this instead of having a resource for loading data? Could we use this for dynamic imports? Because imports are also promises. Absolutely. So this create resource can take anything that resolves to a promise, any function that returns a promise. So you can resolve anything that's asynchronous. There are asynchronous APIs in the DOM. You could do this with those as well. And what's kind of neat is react.lazy. What? Lazy? No, it's not here. But they are planning on baking this into React. So if you're using React Loadable or like universal something React like this for code splitting, it's going to be baked in to React. Code splitting is going to be like super, super amazingly, awesomely easy. And I think Dan demos that I don't know if he demos it in this talk. Maybe he does. But there's another talk that he gave at React Fest, and he shows kind of what that looks like. So yeah, that's sweet, super cool. Okay, cool. So let's implement this. Let's see. We'll start with the cache. So the cache, actually here, we'll do a little fun dive into the source code here really quick. So let me go to the simple cache provider code. It's actually not a ton of code. I turned off my line number, so I don't know how many lines it is, but not a crazy amount of code. Lots of this is actually development time warnings and stuff like this. So let's see, create cache. Here it is. Create cache actually takes an invalidator, so if you want to invalidate the entire cache, you can do so, and when you just call that on cache.invalidate, then it will call your invalidator, which presumably should reinstantiate the cache or do like re-render React or whatever. In the examples that I've seen, when this or the invalidator function will re-render the entire app, which in a simple app that makes sense. In a bigger app, you have like a cache for this section of the app, just re-render this section or something. So yeah, it takes an invalidator. We're not going to implement that piece. We don't need to. But a cache object here takes or has a preload property and a read property, and also this type of property, which we're going to have to hack to make it work, because I guess they don't want you to actually create your own cache, which is interesting. Kind of makes sense, I guess. So let's go ahead and we'll make the read property, and then we'll also have the preload property, and then let's just go ahead and take care of this right now. We've got this $$ type of, which is like, that's like AngularJS speak for like, really don't touch this, but I did. Okay, so let's find out what this cache type thing is. It's this hex value that's like just this weird number. So I'll just copy that over. And like any good developer, I'm going to go ahead and call that to do fix this. Just kidding. Say it's a hack sunglasses. Yeah. Okay, so this is a legit cache. The reason that we're doing that is because if we were to try and use this cache with the resource, then it'll actually just log a warning, so it'll just be annoying. It'll still work because it doesn't do that validation in production. But yeah, I don't like the warning, so we're going to do that hack. Okay, so let's first take a look at this read function. So it's being called by the resource. The resource will call cache.read, which makes sense because here we say myResource.read, we pass along the cache, then the resource will call the cache. And so it's being called with the resource, the key, load resource, here actually, it'll be resource hash key, load resource, and then the key. So let's just put those arguments in there. Now for us, the way that the cache or create cache is implemented is it actually creates an individual cache for every resource. It uses a map and it says, okay, this resource has this cache, this resource has this one. We're doing something simple, so we're just going to say, I'm going to make this map object on our cache here. And this is going to just be a regular object mapping our key to value pairs where this is the key and the value is whatever the return value of our read is. So I'm going to ignore the resource because in our case we don't actually, we only have one type of resource and that's this load resource to sleep stuff. The hashed key will actually be the same as the key. The hash key is for taking, like if we were to say load resource some object or whatever, then we need to provide a way to hash that to some unique value. So we're just providing a string, and so that's a sufficient enough key. And so that's why we're not providing a hashing function. So if it's undefined, then it'll just pass along the key. So anyway, so a hash key and key will be the same, so I'm just going to change this to key. And then load resource, this is going to be this load resource function, the thing that we created the resource with in the first place. So we create resource with load resource, that gets us a myResource. When we call read, then myResource will call the cache with itself. Okay. So, or actually it calls it with this thing. Okay, so how are we going to make this work? Let's check the cache. So we'll say cache.map at the key. If that exists, then we'll return it synchronously. Okay, so we'll just return cache.map key. If it does not exist, then we need to go and make a request to go get it, right? So we need to call this load resource function. So I'm going to call this suspended load resource, and we're going to pass the key. And this is going to go make a request to get Pikachu data, whatever it is. And here's the trick. Throw suspended. And let me just double check. I'm pretty sure that's all that we need to do. Oh, right. Sorry. One last thing. So once this has resolved to a value, then we need to load the cache up so that the next time, so when this suspended thing is resolved, then it's going to say, okay, you've resolved. Now let's try to render foobar again. And it's going to call read again, and then it's going to come into here, and it'll just do it again. I actually made this mistake as I was preparing this demo for you. And so we need to make sure that we stick that resolved value in our cache. So we'll say then data, oops, and we'll say cache map at the key equals the data. And then we got to return the data. So that the promise propagates that value. Okay, cool. So this is not going to work. Let's see why really quick. Create resource is not defined. Oh right, here. Let's actually. I'm gonna keep the create resource around for a little bit, just so we can get this cache working, and then we can work on this stuff. Okay, so it's loading, and it eventually does resolve. So we've actually, I mean, the simple cache provider itself does a lot more. This cache.read function does a silly amount of extra work to make things work nicely. But at its most fundamental level, this is all that we're actually doing. We're saying, okay, in that cache that we have, does that key exist in this cache? If it does, then we'll just return it synchronously. Otherwise, we'll throw a promise. Throw this suspended promise. When that suspended promise is resolved, then we'll add that data to our cache. React will go and re-render our component, and it will be in the cache and it will return synchronously. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and implement preload. This one's actually a lot easier to do. We just need to do here, and we can all do it on one line. So we just need to go and fetch the data, and when that data is resolved, then we'll stick it in the cache. Now, I really want to stress, this is not what Simple Cache Provider is doing. It's doing a lot more stuff. Because one thing that we're not doing is, what if I call preload twice, right? Like one after the other, or I'm actually literally calling preload and then calling read. Actually, what's happening here is I am kicking off one promise and then kicking off another one. And so we're doing two promises. So this preload is not entirely complete. We'd have to have like some mechanism for keeping track of promises that are in flight. And if there is a promise in flight, then we should return that one instead. And I just barely thought of that just now. And so I'm not going to try and, maybe if we have time at the end, I'll try to make this preload an actual thing. But fundamentally what it's doing is it says, okay, let's go ahead and do this. And then when the next read comes around, we'll pass the promise that we started when we started preloading this thing. I'll try to do that at the end if we have time. I'm really tempted to just do it right now, but no. Okay, cool. So that's basically the cache, other than what I just said. And what just broke? Key is not defined. Key. Oh, right. Sorry, this also needs resource, key, and load resource. There we go. Okay, sweet. So that's a simple cache. The create resource thing is a little bit more complicated, just a little bit, not a lot. So here, create resource. So this is what a resource is. We call create resource with a function that returns a promise. You call it with any arguments, it doesn't matter. And it returns a promise. It should be called with, I guess, the key. And then the resource itself has two properties, read and preload. And it's just how do you read and preload this particular resource. So that read and preload take two arguments, the cache and the key. So let's go ahead and we'll make our own create resource function. Create resource that takes our, loader, whatever, something that's not the same as everything else. And it'll return read and preload. And it takes that cache and our key. And same with this one. And what does this return? Well, it actually it calls the read and preload functions from the cache. So it's just going to return cache.read. And then we need to pass, let's see, in what order? Resource. Here, let's do resource. And when we're all done here, I'm actually going to refactor it smaller and smaller and smaller until there's a lot less stuff. Return resource. So we're going to pass the resource itself, then we'll pass the key, and then the loader. And we'll do the same thing for preload. And I think what is it? Loading, foo value, and bar value. So it actually doesn't do a whole lot by itself. So those are the two things that you're going to be using when you're using a React Suspense, or at least this the simple cache provider, which you probably will. It's actually pretty likely that you'll be using libraries that use these things. Lots of libraries will kind of implement these things, but yeah, you'll definitely want to understand how this is working, and it's pretty likely that you'll be using these raw APIs yourself as well. You might implement your own cache as well. So let's go ahead and we'll simplify this actually a lot. So the only reason that we needed this type of hack for the cache was because the simple cache provider checks it. So in the read method, if it's a cache, then, or if it's not a cache, then log this warning. But we are not using that resource anymore, so we can get rid of that type of. Cool. Sorry, this is super annoying. Just ignore that error. I don't even know what it is. But it is nothing that concerns us. Okay, so with that, what if instead of my resource preload, we just call it cache preload because it's literally not doing anything for us. So let's do that. Say cache preload, and we don't need to pass the resource. Maybe we do need to pass that load resource, so we can do that. Load resource, cool. And then we could do the same thing with read. It could be cache.read. And instead of passing the cache to itself, we'll pass load resource here as well. Okay, and something's busted. What did I do wrong? Oh, we gotta update this. We don't need to accept the resource anymore. Okay, cool. And then what if, let's see, there were a couple other things that we can simplify. So what if, like, we're just like all right in one file, so this cache can just assume that that's the resource. So it's just the one cache for this particular resource. So I'm going to take this load resource thing, we'll put it up above the cache just to say this thing is important for the cache. We'll just get rid of this. And it only needs the key for our cache. Okay, so then we no longer need to pass load resource. Okay, so that's all that we need there. Now we don't need the resource at all. We're not using my resource anywhere in this file. So that resource is gone. And then, let's see, there was something else that I forgot. Let me just double check. Oh, that's right. So instead, we could say that the cache itself is just this empty object. And then instead of cache.map, we'll just say cache. And then each one of these we'll just say is, there we go. It's a function. We'll get rid of that, get rid of that, get rid of that, and that. Cool, so we just converted these to regular functions that just reference load resource and the cache directly. And then we can get rid of cache here. So now we just preload and read, and it's all still working. Cool, and I think that's as simple as we can make it. So the reason that I did all this refactoring is to simplify this down to the simplest form possible, so that you can see that this isn't actually, like, there's nothing super magical about what it's doing. It's just JavaScript. So what's happening here is we say preload. It's going to call this load resource, and while that's happening, like this is an asynchronous call, it's going to continue on to do this read. And when that preload is finished, it's going to update the cache with that value. And we still need to fix that so that when we call read before that's finished, we can return the same promise. So maybe we can do that here in a sec. When we call read, it's going to just come in here and say, oh, if it's in the cache, then return that value synchronously. Otherwise, we'll throw a promise that's resolved when that value is loaded. So the magic part that I'm not going to have time to explain how this is all working is what React is actually doing in handling this promise. I can't myself write that. I can't write my own version of that in here. React internally has to handle that. But you can conceptually think of it as similar to an error boundary. So when actually, you know what? Let's just, you know, I don't know. Let's just play around with this. We're gonna do debugger right here. Let's just see what it does. What are you doing, React? Okay, I'm gonna have to shrink that down. Okay, so we got a debugger in here. I'm not gonna continue on. I'm gonna jump out. And that's that render root thing. Let's see. Perform work on render. There's got to be a try catch around here somewhere. Is yieldy. Goodness gracious, what? Okay, let's refresh. Okay, then we render root. Okay, here we go. We'll just keep on reset stack. Goodness gracious, I don't know what this stuff is doing. I feel like, did anybody, the three of you that used AngularJS, did you ever dive into Angular code? I don't do that very often with React, but I did that all the time with Angular, and I was always super confused. They did some weird things, and I've been doing that a little bit more recently with React for fun, and I am still super confused. I don't really know what it's doing in here. Dang, I should have looked at this a little bit earlier to figure out where on earth they're doing this try catch. Yeah, here it is. Maybe that's it. Here, let's pause in here. Yeah, there's my debugger. Hey, there we go. Thrown value. There it is. Hey, my friend, thank you. I was about ready to give up. Okay, so let's see. Now they do some development-only stuff, the profile, timer, and whatever. Reset currently processing queue. That's this is probably if development something or other. So it's gonna, or I don't know what that is actually. It's got to do something with this promise. I want to find where it's saying then. Thrown value. Play unit of work on uncaught error. Return fiber. No, it's not null. Throw exception. Okay, I think we missed it. Because I think at this point it's going into the error boundary code. Yeah, throw exception. Let's just dive in there really quick. Incomplete. Source fiber, not complete. Okay. Oh, enable suspense. There we go. There's something. The thenable placeholder component. Okay, that looks interesting. Placeholder component is 16, by the way. I don't know what that is. All right, so then we've got an alternate. I don't know what that's supposed to be either. We got timeouts. Delay MS. See, I told you it was delay MS. I don't know why it was not working, but there's something in there. Now it's handling our, or it's trying to render our placeholder. Scheduled the nearest placeholder to re-render the timed out view. It's kind of cool. And then it keeps on going in this weird while loop. Oh goodness, the code that engineers have to write to make our stuff fast, I'm just so glad they're doing it, not me. Okay, I think we've probably had enough of this, but as you can see, it is kind of fun to dive in and see what React is doing, kind of. Okay, I'm gonna jump out of this stuff. We're gonna do one more thing before I wrap up. Let's turn off this debugger. Before I do this last thing, what I want to do is I want to fix this preload so that we hang on to the promises. We don't launch the same request twice, because that's not fair. Before I do that, though, does anybody have any other questions about what we have so far? Yes, question?
So, does this effectively replace state management libraries? I mean, Redux is its own kind of thing, but unstated or
Yeah, so the question is, does this effectively replace state management libraries like unstated, maybe not Redux, but so no, I wouldn't say, maybe this in combination with context by itself. I see some of these simpler state management libraries as pretty nice ways to manage global application state or like shared state in a bigger section of the tree. And I see them working together kind of nicely. One thing that I really like, though, is that React is slowly eating the ecosystem. And it's like, oh, we don't need that anymore. Like, React loadable, we don't need that anymore. It's built into React. Like, when the context thing came out, like, so many things were irrelevant. And it's only going to get worse and better. Like, worse for people who care about those libraries, but better for everybody else. Yeah, so I wouldn't say that this necessarily replaces those, but it definitely makes it so that you will not have to reach for them as soon. And I would suggest that that's what the context API did for Redux as well, the new context API. It just like, oh, I'm not doing as much prop drilling, maybe I don't need Redux. Yeah, not that prop drilling was the only reason you ever needed Redux, but it's the reason most people reach for it early. So yeah, does that kind of answer your question a little bit? Cool. That's my friend Alex. He's a good person. Any other questions before I try to fix this preload? Yeah.
So with these, basically we are going to create all the functional components, right? So we're not using the class components.
Yeah, good question. So the question was, with these, you're only going to be using function components. You won't need class components anymore. Not with Suspense. Like Suspense will not do that because there's component lifecycles for DOM manipulation and stuff. So you have like a ref, and you need to apply a jQuery plugin to that ref or something like that. So there are definitely Suspense is not going to remove your need for class components. But anything asynchronous, if that's the only reason you need it to be a class component, then yes, you don't need a class component. But this is totally backward compatible. You can still use your class components even with Suspense. There's no reason you can't mix these. Another question, yeah?
From your perspective, is there any reason that they didn't do this kind of API earlier on, or why are they doing this now? Is it just because they hadn't thought of it? Or?
Yeah, good question. So why didn't they do this earlier on? I ask myself the same question every time I wonder why we don't have hoverboards yet. No, just kidding. I think it's mostly they hadn't thought of it, or maybe they thought of it but hadn't been able to think of an API that worked nicely. The thing is that Facebook has 50,000 React components. How many React components do you think you've written in your life? Probably not 50,000. And in your entire company, probably not 50,000. That's like a lot of React components. I mean, styled components is helping because everything's a component, but no, like we don't write that many components. But Facebook has a silly amount of components, so they can't just like shift APIs around a lot. And so like when they add a feature to React, it needs to either be backward compatible or code moddable to automatically upgrade your stuff. So maybe they thought of this idea like, oh, what if we did this? But they weren't able to implement it in a way that was backward compatible. Also, I probably should have mentioned this first. This wouldn't be possible without the huge rewrite of React Core, the React Fiber. So when React had the React stack, the old way that it was, the scheduler was implemented, this wasn't possible. And so they had to rewrite all of React first before they could implement this sweet new API. So, and I feel like there's, this is only the beginning of the cool new things that we can look forward to from React. It's pretty sweet. Any other questions? One question that I'm surprised nobody's asked yet is like throwing a promise. That feels so wrong. If you're unfamiliar, in JavaScript, the virtual machines or in the implementations of JavaScript, the language, when you throw something, you're automatically putting your code on the slow path because it's hard to optimize that situation. And so, like, that was my first response to this, was like, I wonder what that will do to performance to be throwing promises in the render method. So the reason I'm bringing that up is so that when you think about that later, or if somebody asks you, you can say, well, we're literally making a request that's going to take 2 seconds to complete. I think like 2 extra milliseconds is probably going to be okay. And in exchange for such a sweet API, I'm not too worried about that. Okay, cool. Who wants me to fix this preload thing? Who wants me to be done? Anybody want me to be done? Who doesn't want to be rude but still wants me to be done? Okay, just kidding. Okay, I'll try to wrap this up. I promise I'm not going to take more than another 5 minutes on this, try to make this work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a promise cache. And we'll say if the value is actually in the cache right now, then we'll just return the value. Then we'll check the promise cache for that key. And if it is in there, then we'll return that one. Yeah, this is going to be pretty quick. So then we can get our promise. And we'll take the promise cache, add that key, and say promise. And that's it. Actually, that was easy. Oh, no, it wasn't that easy. Objects are not valid. Oh, right. Oh, snap. We're going to throw. That's right. Throw that. Okay, cool. So now we're not making double, we're not calling that twice. And actually we can prove this. I didn't actually prove this is what's happening. We're going to say making request. Okay, so we make the request twice, once for, oh no, it's happening, here, hold on, what? Making request, and again, oh gosh. That's weird. Load resource. Sorry, what? Oh, I need, yeah, right here, right? So write promise cache at key equals suspended. Is that what you're talking about? Crossing our fingers. Well, shucks. Okay, here, let's say loading resource in read. And we'll call, oh, you know what? Actually, this is actually really important. I know what's going on. So we're preloading, making request, preloading, making request, preload, blah, 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 blah. All this is happening in preload. None of those are actually loading resource in read. The reason is because we're preloading in the component. So I'm glad that we did this because I just taught you something that's totally wrong. We're going to fix it right now. So anybody who watched this later on YouTube, I'm sorry if you stopped early because you learned something wrong. So you have to preload outside of the component that is throwing the promise. Because when that promise resolves, it's going to try and re-render that, and we're constantly preloading. So like one way we could get around this is we could say if promise cache at key, then we just return, do nothing. That would work, I guess, and then we can. I don't know what the simple cache provider does, so let's, once we get this fixed, okay, that's going to be fixed. Sweet, okay, that worked. And we never actually had to load the resource and read because we're preloading it, so that's cool. So let's see what happens if we do this with the cache provider because I'm curious now. So I've got, yeah, preload right here, and let me just get rid of all this stuff. Preload. Okay. So I'm going to add that console log here. Loading stuff. Okay, so we get that loading stuff one time. If I move this into the component, yeah, I guess it looks like it handles it too. Nice. Okay, so feel free to do that thing that I said don't do. And please don't use the cache that I created because it is buggy. Okay, that's pretty much it. Like I said, this was not a why talk. If you're still like, so I don't understand why this is useful, I'm sorry. I tried to establish that this isn't what we're going to talk about today. Go watch Dan's talk because it's fantastic, and he does some really cool stuff. Watch this one because they're if all you want to learn about is suspense, then watch this. Actually, watch them both. They're great. But if you only want to watch one and you just want to learn about suspense, watch this one because he shows a couple extra cool things in here that he didn't show in his original JS Conf talk. But learning about time slicing is also very cool, so watch them both. I watched them on 2 times speed because I don't watch anything slow, even TV shows. Okay, cool. Here, actually, let me just check. Let's see, maybe some people here are asking questions you might like. Does this include a demo and resources from React 17? No. Actually, if you go to unpackage.com, React, if you haven't used Unpackage before, it's amazing. But these are the files that are on NPM for React. And it has this version selector. You can see there's a version 16.4.0-alpha. This is the version of React that you're looking at. And you can look in here and see the cool things that are there. So this will be React 16.4 or 16.5. I think, yeah, I'm pretty sure this is coming like in the next couple months, month or two. It's pretty awesome. Somebody wrote a blog post that actually polyfilled all of React Suspense using error boundaries. It's pretty cool. You can go read that blog post. They also polyfill the React timeout component and placeholder. Please watch that Elon video next. Maybe I will. Okay. What is with that odd F font? All right. Everybody watch. I get this every single time. kcd.im/myfonttheme. MFT. I was going to do kcd.im WFT, what the font, or what font tech theme, but yeah. Anyway, it's my font theme. So here it is. It is Dank SH and Night Owl. They're fantastic. Suspending does multiple render attempts. Yes, thank you, Swix. This person is smart, and he actually created this thing, Fresh Async React, where you can find a lot of up-to-date resources on both time slicing as well as suspense. So yeah, go Google that. This guy is an awesome person. He spoke at React Rally. Sean, he's just cool dude. All right, I think that's it. Does anybody have last-minute questions before I stop talking? All right, cool. Thanks, everybody. Oh, by the way, all of this stuff that you saw is on GitHub. It is, what is this called? Here, I've got this cool thing, Git browse. It's React Suspense simple example. So you can go check this out and play around with stuff. All right, thanks. Bye, YouTube.